I'm Eleanor. Welcome or welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about what I've been reading, both prose and poetry, for the last 2 weeks, and generally what I've been thinking about. So first of all, I have read a novel. It's nice to get back in the saddle again with prose. This is called Diary of a Void by Yagi. It is translated from the Japanese by David Boyd and Lucie North. It's about a woman in her 30s who lives in Japan, I believe Tokyo. She has an office job. She decides to fake a pregnancy, and it's about the difference in her view of herself and the view society has of her. That seems like a rather simple premise, and it is in a way. If you want to hear more details, I would recommend you go and listen to Willow at Bow. I think it's called Books and Bow. Let me get the name right. Books and Bow. A quote from Willow's review that I've been thinking about quite a lot is that at some point towards the latter half of the book, the message was almost losing track of itself. And for Willow, that was possibly a problem. For me, that's what elevated the book to a higher level, because the message that society looks after pregnant women better than they do non-pregnant women is really quite dull. But the idea that there's more to it and that there's something beyond that the novel is trying to get to was very intriguing to me. And I think what to me was the most important thing in this novel, and I'm hesitating because I really don't want to give any spoilers, is that being pregnant in reality and being a mother of a baby in reality is a completely different thing from being so in the mind of society, from other people's point of view, and also generally in literature. So the minute you have a novel that's pretending, I mean, a novel is fiction, yeah? So it's lying to you. That's what it's doing. It's making up a story that's not true. Now, in this case, Yagi is writing about a protagonist who's pretending to be pregnant. So you've got those two layers. You've got the way Yagi has chosen to show pregnancy and motherhood via her fiction. And then you have the protagonist whose name is Shibota, the way Shibota chooses to present her own fictional pregnancy and motherhood. And then, of course, you have the society in the book and the readers. So that makes for a very, very interesting book, and I do highly recommend it. If you're like me and maybe you're trying to get back into novels but are finding it tough going, as I have been, I do highly recommend it. The other book that I finally read is a book by Leonora Carrington. And this book is called The Debutante and Other Stories. Now, look at this book. This book did not come this way. I have a greyhound called Augie, and this is what he did. And the fact that he did this, which he never ever does, shows how entranced I was with this book, because I was supposed to take him out for a walk, and I kept saying to myself, just another story, just another story. And didn't pay attention to him, and he finally grabbed it from, when I put it down to take a sip of my tea, he grabbed it and immediately just took it off to his bed and started chewing through it. And I just think it's a good match for the kind of book this is, because this is a crazy ass book. This is a book that makes rarely any sense. I mean, it's a collection of short stories, so none of them made sense to me, really. But they didn't make sense in a very good way. Now, I have heard of Leonora Carrington. She's come back into vogue. She's a writer who, what are her dates? Let me just look it up for you. So her date, she was born 1917, died 2011. She had a very long, good life. She was a surrealist, a painter, artist, and writer. And very well known at the time, but not the most known, probably because she was a woman, but you know, who knows. Nowadays, it seems for the past several years, her name has come up, and I had noticed that, and it looked like it was right up my alley, but something kept holding me back from it. It's funny. What did I write on my notes? I wrote on my notes, "Be honest, Eleanor!" ! It's very tempting for me to say, these stories don't make sense, but that's wonderful and I love them. And, you know, if there's one thing I've sworn not to do on this channel is not to lie. Also not to hurt anyone's feelings. But in any case, it's a work in progress. So what is it that I'm tempted to lie about? The fact is that I don't enjoy the actual reading process of these short stories because they irk me. They irk me because they don't give me the buzz that a usual fairy tale would. And these are stories that are framed and have vocabulary that is very similar to fairy tales. They have strange animals, they have the woods and odd houses, they have spells and people with supernatural powers, people who turn into animals, objects that start growing like plants. There are several stories that have crazy vegetables in them, vegetables that jump into the sink and wash themselves, which I love. What are the other vegetables? I have to tell you about the vegetables. Oh yeah, there's one short story where the vegetables have to be whipped by the religious women. Yes, the religious women whip the vegetables because that is the only way the vegetables will go to heaven or some such. It's fantastic. Now, there's also something that happens in each short story which stops you short in your tracks. So you are never able to make a complete comparison between anything you're reading and real life. So at no point can you see generally an emotional or intellectual correlation between what you know of the world and the world of this strangeness. And on top of that, the ending of each and every story stops you from having that lovely sense of finality which you get from the fairy tales that you're familiar with. And the most wonderful thing about this volume, about this publication, is that it has an introduction by Sheila Heti. And if you've been playing along, you know that Sheila Heti is one of my favorite contemporary writers and thinkers. I am never disappointed by Sheila Heti. And in her introduction here, I'm not disappointed either. And here's something that she writes in the introduction. How many writers today would dare to write as Carrington does? Everyone tries to make so much sense. not only to themselves, but to others especially. I don't know if she was trying to make sense also to her surrealist friends, but I know that sense was low on their list of values. Today it is too high. And one day Sheila Heti will get into poetry, and then my life will be complete. But until then, I just love what she says about sense making here. And can I also show you, there's a photo right before the introduction. This is Leonora Carrington with 3 other, I don't know who they are, friends, surrealists, I'm not sure. But it's made me question who I am. Am I a surrealist? If I was living in the 1920s in Paris, would I be a surrealist? I think I might. I think I might have been. I do love it so very much. In any case, about the way the endings don't satisfy, that also means that it's, funnily enough, quite difficult, or at least I found it very difficult to remember what the short stories are about. I had to make notes and underline things a lot to remind myself. And that's another thing. It's just a different way of viewing your reading and viewing writing, viewing the world. It's extraordinarily exciting. It's never boring. It can be very frustrating. So it's not for everyone, but I mean, what is for everyone? I think it's for everyone. So, yeah. Then what else have I been thinking about apart from prose is I've been thinking a lot about poetry. I mentioned that this was something I was reading a few weeks ago, and I did finally finish it. And I would say if you are at all interested in being a better poetry reader, apart from writing, which is a completely different thing, but if you're interested in really understanding the craft, this little book, it's very readable. I wouldn't recommend reading it cover to cover. I would recommend having it on your night table and picking it up every so often. I love it. I love this little book. Now, why would you want, as a poetry reader, to read about the craft of poetry? And I was thinking about that because it seems like a lot of work to do. You know, you can pick up a novel and you don't have to, have read a book about how to write a novel. But then I thought about sports. If you're a fan of anything, or music, or, if you're a fan of a band, you tend to want to know as much information as you can about that thing that you love. If you're a real fan, you want everything. If you're a baseball fan, I've seen these baseball fans, they have, they memorize what to me is trivia, and statistics, and they know the names of all the players. They know exactly what's happening when it's happening, and they delve into the ins and outs of the rules of the game. And as a poetry reader, I want that for myself as well. I want to know the ins and outs of the game. This gives you the ins and outs of the game. And then the next time you pick up a poem or a collection of poems, you will view it differently. Just as someone who knows the rules of tennis, I'm laughing because there are people in my life I'm very close to who are very, very into tennis. And I've tried, God help me, I have tried to really understand the laws of the rules of tennis. I cannot. Poetry is no problem. So, pick your hobby, pick your love. But when you are a fan, you want as much knowledge as possible. And I think that's also another thing which I'm finding out, because at the moment I'm in an incredibly exciting workshop very, very good workshop on versification, on, you know, how to scan a poem, meter, form, rhyme, etc. But mostly the meter and how to form a line and how to be able to manipulate a line, and also how to scan a line when you're reading it as a reader. That to me, you know, that also brought the question to mind, Eleanor, why are you doing this? Well, first of all, I just love it. I just love learning this stuff, and I love learning it from the best, which I am doing. And so then I thought, well, for heaven's sake, why wouldn't you? I mean, if you love a person, you want to find out everything you can about them. I mean, of course, there are boundaries, but you naturally, that's your natural instinct. When you love a songwriter, you want to find out more about the songwriting. And so I love poetry, and I'm trying to find out more about that. So hence that book, The Line. But then something interesting happened. So I'm in this versification workshop. I've just read the Art of the Poetic Line. And I also happen to have bought a couple of new books, new poetry books. This one I bought secondhand. It's Seamus Heaney, Electric Light. And this one, because I read Alice Oswald for the Sealy Challenge, and I really enjoyed her, I saw this at the bookstore, and I bought it. It's Falling Awake. It's one of her more recent ones. What's the date on this? 2016. Both of the books have the first poems. When I opened each book to the first poem, I realized immediately this was going to be very, very helpful to me, because I could put what I was learning about the craft of poetry into action. So with Seamus Heaney, the first poem is At Toombridge. It's this, and what I'll do is I'll put the photo in. And I won't talk about the entire poem. I will just mention that the last 3 lines were very helpful to me, because I was able to analyze them using what I'm beginning to learn about the craft. And it really felt like, oh, okay, now I'm learning the laws of, now I'm learning the rules of tennis. And then, of course, once you know the rules of tennis, you can see when they're not being applied. And so then that gives you the texture in the poem. So what I'm looking at now is, where negative ions in the open air are poetry to me, as once before the slime and silver of the fattened eel. And, you know, you read it and you realize that there's a rhythm, but you don't really understand where it's coming from. But then applying some of the things that I'm trying to teach myself, and hopefully this will not make you cringe if you know more about prosody than I do. So I'm looking at the meter of that third from last line. Where negative I ons in the open air. You've got the I ams, but you have the one exception, which is the anapest gative I. So where ne is the I am, and then gative I is the anapest, and then you have ons in the open air, and you go back to the I am. Next line, a poetry to me as once before, perfect iambic pentameter. And then the final line, the slime and silver of the fattened eel. Now, of course, when you read it, you're not going to read it in that odd robotic way, but it's hard for me right now to tell you how much joy I found in being able to analyze those 3 lines. And then going to Alice Oswald, the first poem is a short story of falling. I'm not going to put that in as a photo, because it really is all iambic pentameter with couplets that rhyme. It is the story of the falling rain to turn into a leaf and fall again. It is the secret of a summer shower to steal the light and hide it in a flower. So simple and yet so beautiful. And now that I know what it is that she's doing, I really love it. But what I love more is the second poem, and that's called Swan. Now, Swan. So it has some interesting, it's an interesting setup, as you can see. I'll put a photo in, but then I'll zoom in on the last 5 stanzas, because it changes form into these last 5 stanzas here. And I think what it's doing, I should say, first of all, those last 5 stanzas, the subject matter of it is just really absolutely stunning to me. The way she has managed to take the image of a swan that has died, and you see it, it takes my breath away. You see it on the snow. And this is terrible paraphrasing. It's terrible to paraphrase a poem, but just to introduce you to it. And then it changes. After the quick, it changes to these 5 stanzas that bring the poem to an end. And it goes into a rhythm, and I think it goes into a rhythm that is, it's not metric, it's counting the beats, but not in a regular way. It's just counting beats. Say something to the frozen cloud of the head before it thaws, whose one dead eye is a growing cone of twilight in the middle of winter. It is snowing there, and the bride has just set out to walk to her wedding. But how can she reach the little backlit church? It is so cold. The bells like iron angels hung from one note keep ringing and ringing. I think, again, this is me thinking out loud. How did she do this? How did she do this? I think she did it by with the rhythm of 2, 3, and 2. Say something to the frozen cloud of the head before it thaws. 2, 3, 2. Whose one dead eye is a growing cone of twilight in the middle of winter. 2, 3, 2 again. It is snowing there, and the bride has just set out to walk to her wedding. But how can she reach the little blacklit church? It is so cold. The bells like iron angels hung from one note keep ringing and ringing. The bells like iron angels hung from one note keep ringing and ringing. I'm not sure about that last one, what the rhythm is. I think she's changed the rhythm. Keep ringing and ringing, or keep ringing and ringing. It depends on how you read it, of course. But in any case, there's a regular rhythm that's happening, and it's happening because of the regular rhythm. What she's describing is elevated to such a degree that I see it in my mind's eye in a way. The bride sitting out, and it can't be explained. It doesn't make sense. Well, it doesn't to me, but emotionally it does. And I love it. So there you have it. Now, I'm hesitating. Will I put this bit in the video because do I want to show everyone that I really am not sure about the rhythm of the poem and this or that? Yes. What do I care if I'm not perfect with, I'm looking into it. It's not like, it's not like brain surgery and I'm not having an exam on it. This is me talking to myself. But then I also want to mention that it's very enticing to find an essay about a poem that you're not quite sure about. You're not quite sure about a poem and you look online or you look in a book and you find that someone who has more knowledge has written about that poem. And I think there's really something to be said for that. And in my case, this past 2 weeks, I received another book that I'd ordered by Lucie Brock-Broido, The Obsession Continues, A Hunger. And the first poem in the book, Domestic Mysticism. I won't read it. I won't get into it. I love it. But there was a lot in it that bewildered me. And I have had quite a few poems like that with Lucie Brock-Broido. And I think I reached my limit. I am only human, and I thought, damn, I just need someone else to talk about this with. And wouldn't you know it, I went online and there was a reference to a reviewer and poet and poetry professor from Harvard called Stephanie Burt. And she has written an essay about it. And wouldn't you know it, I have the book that essay is written in. I have that book on an old Kindle of mine, which I rekindled from the back of the drawer. And so I thought I'd mention that. I thought I'd mention Stephanie Burt actually, because the book that she wrote, amongst many books, is The Poem Is You, came out in 2016, 60 Contemporary American Poets and How to Read Them. Now, a lot of these kinds of books are not the best, when they talk about how to read a poem. But in this case, I really trust Burt. And she did not disappoint. It's a fantastic essay. And I do highly recommend this book, The Poem Is You. And anything else that she's written, if you go online and if you're interested just in generally reading something that a really good, knowledgeable person is writing about contemporary American poetry, she's the one to go to. Checking my notes. Oh yes, another thing. One last thing that was really on my mind, especially in the last couple of days. I've been thinking a lot about what I get very passionate about, what gets me riled up, why I get emotional about certain things that don't mean anything to other people. And it really didn't make sense to me. And I'm thinking now in terms of things I'm reading. Sometimes novels, sometimes prose, sometimes certain genres, but mostly poetry. And there's certain characteristics and certain subjects that really rile me up. And I think to myself, after I've, had that emotional, passionate moment, I think to myself, this is a tempest, like this is a storm in a teacup. Like, why are you getting so passionate? Why are you taking it so personally? And something that helped me realize why I was taking poetry so seriously. I mean, even prosody, even genre, I just take it so personally. So by chance, I went back to a book that I've had on my shelf since I graduated with my bachelor degree, which was, and I'm showing my age, which I don't mind. So, you know, I mean, I'm in my 50s. I graduated in 1991. And this was the book when I did the one poetry course I did on biblical poetry. No, there were two courses. There were two poetry courses I did. But mostly I studied prose. Anyway, this book, which is from the 1980s, I kept for decades now. The Idea of Biblical Poetry, Parallelism and Its History by James L. Kugel. I decided to pick this up again, and there was my marginalia from, you know, the late 1980s. And there was a chapter called, where is it now? Called The Meter of Biblical Songs. And so I read that chapter. And a couple of things, where are my notes? Because now I've forgotten, there were so many things that it brought to mind. Something that really helped me in this book was realizing that any interpretation of any text is, in a way, an attempt to control language. And if you are someone who cares about language, you see, I'm getting emotional. I care about language. I mean, it's kind of embarrassing, but okay. I care so much about language. And so when I read a review, or when I read an interpretation, or I have a discussion even, I'm not really just talking about the book or the poem. What I'm doing is assessing who has control, who controls the language. And I'm not talking about the publishing world and, you know, gatekeepers. No, not at all. I'm talking about any text that's out there. And in this case, let's take a poem. Who is trying to control my interpretation of that poem? And also, as someone who is not an academic, you know, I got my bachelor degree, but then after that I left academia entirely and still have nothing to do with it other than enjoying, you know, reading books. As having that background, so I have enough knowledge to know that I don't have enough knowledge. Yeah, I don't have a master's. I don't have a PhD. I'm coming to it with raw emotion and a lot of passion. I feel that I need to defend my right to control my own reading of the poems. And now that's not necessarily true. I don't need to defend myself. I mean, no one has come and attacked me in any way. But I do have that very natural reaction. And why did that come out of this book, this Kugel book? It's because what James L. Kugel is discussing when he's discussing meter in biblical poetry is really discussing the different ways that religious leaders attempted to control the view others had of God, Judaism, and generally religions, trying to control the reading of it. So, for example, what does it mean when a section of biblical text that is more or less accepted by everyone to be a poem or poetic, what does it mean when that poem has in it repetition? if you're a religious person and you believe that it's a holy text and every word is holy, then you necessarily believe that repetition has to mean something. It can't be repetition for its own sake. And so you see what I'm getting at. You begin to control the narration around the way the text is understood. Poetry cannot be written just for the fun of it. It has to have reason behind it. And that reason is connected in this case to religion. Now, of course, nowadays when I read a review of a poetry book, generally speaking, I don't think I've ever come across, someone interpreting a book because of their religious affiliation. But in a way, the control there is still the same. If you're a teacher, for example, and you teach that nothing in a poem can be extraneous, that is dogmatic, and it is reminiscent of these older religious leaders. In any case, I thought that was interesting. I hear, you probably can't hear, but I can hear Augie, my greyhound, scratching at the door. I believe he wants to keep me company, and I'm finished anyway, so I'll just go ahead and edit this. In any case, I'd like to say that going forward, my two hopes for the discussions I have on this channel is A, to be honest about my own opinion and value my own opinion, and B, attempt to do that without hurting anyone's feelings. And I'll do my best to do that. So with that in mind, I wish you all the very best. And don't forget, the only real property is the property of the mind. Okay, bye.